sort of in Montana. She loved birds. I go to that and she was just so
amazing. Yeah, the grandkids put the kid out with the grandkids, because it is neat where you can, you know, hear the voice and then tell you what it is.
What? Oh, how do you ever have a property in Rapid City?
Long story. Hi, Nancy.
Okay.
Yeah, we are recording. And it is almost 1 o'clock. And are you a panelist? Can you he just upgraded. Oh, okay. Okay.
This is gonna be on the meeting, like talking like this. I didn't realize so right in the morning, so until 11. Our meeting's at 11:30. I'll get there by then. See what I can do.
turn the computer on. And it's hard to see. There's a button that, I mean, it's easy to see. Hard to tell on what.
Where's the computer?
It's to the right hand of the TV screen.
It's not the TV screen.
Right, it's over on the right a little bit.
Are we ready?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no problem. So we're just now after 1 o'clock and call the meeting to order. Note that we have members Thorpe, Lohr,
Thompson.
Jones?
Thompson.
Yeah, Thompson, from, and let's see, what's this guy's name, Vizier, and Isaacson. Do we have a forum? Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
So I know. So we're just about to go to public comment, and I'll start with you, Mr. Versick. I can see you have your hand up.
Thank you. Actually, you just, Tom Versick speaking, just corrected what the issue was, that there was some poor audio. And for whatever it's worth, just to feedback on the video, I can see Mr. Lohr and everyone who is towards the dais. Well, if there are other people on camera, they can't be seen. Just giving you, oh, there's another angle. That's all fine and well, just giving you feedback because I don't know who else is looking at a screen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Versick. Any other public comment? Not seeing any raised hands. We'll move into today's agenda. I'll start with a brief introduction to the item, and I'm going to turn the meeting over to Gus Yates, our hydrogeologist consultant extraordinaire. Come on, Gus, that was for you. There's a little smile. All right, so we have been talking about demand management. The board has directed the staff of the Arroyo Seco GSA to begin to develop a demand management program for the Arroyo Seco cone. So Mr. Yates has begun that process and developed some information. Also, by way of background, Mr. Yates is also our representative on the SMC TAC, Technical Advisory Group, for our management criteria. And he and I saw some data and some model runs from Montgomery and Associates relative to the forebay that we had some question about. And I'm not going to steal Gus's thunder, but to frame it, Gus did a lot more work into delving into the details, which we'll talk about today, and it'll kind of lay the framework for us to move, I believe, more into a data-driven approach to demand management. So with that, Gus, how'd I do?
That sounds great. Yeah. So if you want, I'll share my screen and jump into a presentation.
Yeah. Gus, our audio in here is a little sketchy.
Okay.
So you need to use your outside voice.
Okay, let me, I don't know. Okay, I will be loud. All right, here we go. Okay, are you seeing a PowerPoint show? Okay. Hold on a second. All right. Okay, this presentation is to run some concepts about demand management and how they might best be implemented in the Arroyo Seco or anywhere actually in the Salinas Valley. I prepared this for last month and we had some technical difficulties, so now you get to see it. Um, and I'll start with a little bit of background. So there have been two parallel efforts dealing with addressing how do we deal with potentially declining water levels. In 2024, the SMC TAC developed some procedures for detecting long-term water level declines in the forebay and upper valley subbasins. But we didn't really say what to do about it. And I'll get into that in a bit. And then in 2025, Montgomery and Associates, with a sort of valley-wide perspective, developed a demand management framework that was looking at how demand management might be implemented throughout the valley. In reviewing those two efforts, my feeling is that neither effort is really a complete procedure for detecting a trend and kind of responding to it in terms of what should we do and where and when and how much. However, both efforts have some strengths and weaknesses, so I went through them and I'm going to walk you through that a little bit and tried to merge kind of the best of both into a process that I think is substantive and sticks with the data, but doesn't overreact or underreact to a declining water level trend. And I was volunteered to be the guinea pig to do this. So you're the first audience to see what this thinking is.
Hold on, guys, 1 second. Yeah, Tim?
Gus, when you're making the presentation, are you making the presentation to us representing criteria of the Fort Bay or criteria of the Arroyo Seco?
These criteria, as you'll see, really could be the process I'm outlining could be applied really anywhere, but it's intended for initially to just we'll look at it from an Arroyo Seco standpoint. But it could be applied anywhere in the valley. So demand management is kind of a scary term because I mean it means pumping less groundwater, right? But as a management response to water supply reductions, it has some advantages, and I list those here. Compared to some new water supply project that involves diversions or reservoirs or pipelines, it can be implemented on pretty short notice. The geographic area over which you implement demand management is flexible. The amount of pumping reduction is flexible, and the duration of reduction is flexible. So it offers a lot of flexibility to tailor the demand management or the pumping reduction to the location where it's really needed and only as long as needed. So I'll start with a summary of the SMC tax procedure and its strengths and weaknesses. We envisioned evaluating long-term trends every 5 years, coincident with the GSP update. It takes at least 5 years to get enough data to shift a long-term trend anyway. And we came up with a statistical method for evaluating trends over a selected historical period. And we said apply that to the representative monitoring site wells that are in the GSP and the alternative wells, which are also indicated in the GSP. And we set a sort of a benchmark at which we thought, maybe an action would be appropriate. And that was if 35% of the wells have declining trends, then do some additional analysis about factors that might be correlated with those declines: pumping, rainfall, stream flow, irrigated acres, et cetera. And then inform the implementation committees of our findings, that there are declines, where we think they are and how much, and whether we think some action should be taken. We haven't come up with listing what action should be taken. So demand management would be a candidate, but we didn't really list any specific actions. So here's some issues with the procedure we have at this point. The trends aren't compared against the minimum thresholds, and I'll show you in a minute analysis I did of trends where you can see that, yeah, there's declining trends, but they're in water levels that are pretty high. So it takes many years, it'd be many years before that trend would reach a minimum threshold. So maybe it's not an urgent problem, in other words. We also found that the statistical results were pretty sensitive to which period you used for analysis. I think Montgomery and Associates run into the same issue. Our analysis is retrospective only. It doesn't involve modeling. It relies only on data, so it's just historical. It doesn't have a way to look forward. So that's a potential limitation. And then again, we haven't gotten as far as tailoring or recommending management actions relative to a declining trend. This slide illustrates what I mean by trends that are real, but maybe not urgent. So I went through every single water hydrograph in the forebay and upper valley areas that had complete data from the mid 1990s to present, and just visually drew trend lines, which are the green line, and then selected a minimum threshold equal to the lowest water level in 2015, which was the way we selected minimum thresholds in the GSP for the representative monitoring wells. And here are some examples where, yeah, you can see a declining trend, but it would be decades, in some cases over 100 years before that decline reaches the minimum threshold. So there's a question of, well, is that something we should take an action right away, or maybe we don't need to take an action right away? Maybe we should wait till the minimum threshold is, we're closer to the minimum threshold, and we are closer, in other words, to undesirable results. So now I'm going to summarize and evaluate the Montgomery and Associates procedure. They also thought a 5-year interval for updating the analysis is appropriate. And their approach counted the number of RMS wells below their minimum threshold in each of the preceding 5 years. And if in any of those years, if more than 15% of the wells were below the minimum threshold, that counted as an undesirable result. And then they tallied up, well, how many of the previous 5 years had undesirable results? And since there were 5 years, they had a scoring system of 0 to 5 based on the number of years that had undesirable results. They also had a step where they simulated the current conditions into the future using the groundwater model. So instead of looking just at historical conditions, which, looking at these longer time periods might not exactly represent current conditions, they could use the model to say, well, if we keep with our current conditions, what happens in the future with variable hydrology and all this? And they focus quite a bit on 2042 because that's the specific year for when Sigma wants you to be sustainable. And that focus has some drawbacks. Here's my analysis of their procedure. I think the advantages are it sort of incorporates a level of severity concept, which could theoretically correlate to how much pumping reduction you do, for example. It relates the water levels to the minimum thresholds, which the SMC TAC method didn't, and it projects into the future, which can be helpful. The limitations are that they do the analysis only at a subbasin scale. So if there's a local area within the subbasin that has a problem, but the rest of the subbasin doesn't, it all gets kind of lumped together. Their method doesn't allow you to differentiate. And they don't really say where, when, and how much demand management to implement. They didn't get to that point. There's a problem with the 5-year period they're using for analysis. I think they picked that because that's the number of years between their updates. But if a drought comes along, a lot of them are several years long, and as long as the drought is still within that 5-year period, it's going to look like you have a lot of undesirable results, but it's really a temporary effect rather than a long-term effect. So that becomes problematic. I think there's too much focus on 2042, and that particularly gets to be a problem if there happens to be a drought in 2042. The whole thing falls apart because it looks like we haven't achieved sustainability when in fact all we have is a drought, a temporary drought. And they also, for their lower severity stages, they talk about using measurable objectives. And there's a sort of a problem with the measurable objective concept as a target, because in any groundwater basin, you're going to want to use your storage capacity. I mean, that's what groundwater basins are for. You use your storage to carry you through a drought, and then you fill it back up. So there's going to be times when you're below your measurable objectives. That's just part of kind of conjunctive use. So tying some of their measures to measurable objectives, I think doesn't really help. So now I'm going to walk you through what I am suggesting as a procedure that sort of takes some of the best of these two processes and gets us from analysis and detection of a long-term trend to what we do about it. So I'm starting with, update the analysis every 5 years. That's good. Select a historical analysis period that's at least 20 years long. And you want to be careful picking that. You don't want it to start or end in an exceptionally wet or dry period. So there's details about how you pick that, but it needs to be reasonably long. Then implement the SMC TAC trend method, the Mann-Kendall method, at the RMS and alternative wells, and also plot the visual trends for all the wells, which is what I did. And that was frankly quite informative. Your eyes are able to see trends pretty well, that actually sometimes better than the statistics can. So it's helpful. It's a great additional piece of information. Then use the SVIHM model to simulate the current conditions, that's pumping, cropping, and population, for 50 years of representative hydrology. So we get that future outlook piece that M&A had. And then look to see whether those future trends seem to be different than the historical ones from our 20-year plus year analysis period. So we want to see if we think we're, the future is going to be different than the past, just before we do anything. And then from the visual analysis or the statistical analysis, flag all the wells where a long-term declining trend would reach the minimum threshold within 20 years. And there's a couple reasons to pick that kind of time frame. One is that it means you're not too close to the minimum threshold yet. So if a drought comes along, you might be starting a little bit low, but you're not right down at your minimum threshold. If you put a drought on top of, if you start a drought at your minimum threshold, you're going to be way below your minimum threshold during that drought. And also 20 years gives you time to, if you want to build a project of some sort, it gives you time to sort of plan that, design it, and build it. So there's, I consider the 20 years kind of negotiable, but it's you can see why I picked that. Okay, next step is to plot all the trend analysis wells on a map and highlight the ones where they're going to reach the minimum threshold within 20 years. So this is looking for local problems rather than just subbasin-wide issues. So yeah, inspect the map for local clustering and circle those locations where more than 15% of the trend wells would reach their minimum threshold within 20 years. I'll show an example in a second. And then, keeping our SMC TAC method, look at trends, concurrent trends, and potential correlating factors. So you want to know, are these declining trends driven by kind of an increase in demand, increased crop area, increased pumping, or by a decrease in recharge, decreased stream flow or rainfall? I did that recently because we are in fact seeing declining trends. And the SMC tax said we should look into these correlating factors. So I sort of assigned myself that task. And basically what emerged quite clearly was that the declines are related to kind of extended, slightly dry conditions, not an increase in pumping or cropping or demand. Then the other thing you might do is consider actions other than demand management, some kind of water supply project. If you think, if it looks like we have a long-term imbalance, um, then maybe we want to do some kind of water import project or whatever it might be. Otherwise, demand management, for the reasons I said earlier, might be a good choice. Here's when I did that visual trend analysis, I ranked the trends in 5 different categories: level, slightly decreasing, fast decrease, slight increase, and fast increase. And the dark red dots are the fast declines. And look at this. You see, there's actually is kind of a cluster there west of the Arroyo Seco. Um, I haven't dug into why that might be, but there is sort of a cluster. And that's the sort of situation I'm suggesting you might want to circle that cluster and focus on demand management there if it seems appropriate, rather than the whole forebay or the forebay and the upper valley. Elsewhere, you see kind of a mix of blue, orange, and pink and yellow dots. No clear clustering, but that might be a cluster there that's worth a local demand management program. Then if the SMC TAC decides that demand management is the best option, you could, I think the appropriate thing to do is kind of phase it in. So you circle your area where you want to implement it, and then say we're going to start with a reduction of 5% for the next 5 years. That 5% didn't come totally out of the blue. Montgomery and Associates did some model runs where they decreased pumping in each of the sub basins by various amounts, and one of the amounts was 7%, and they happened to find that a 7% pumping reduction in the forebay actually leveled out all the hydrographs. So it's the kind of magnitude that would be appropriate for a first step. And then you do that for 5 years and then look at the trends again. And if they still seem to be declining too much, going to reach the MT in 20 years, then for the next 5 years, you bump it up to 10%. And you can continue that kind of ramp down till the trends go away. And that way you've kind of done the minimum amount of pumping reduction in terms of quantity and location necessary to address a long-term declining trend. And so that's what I was aiming for in coming up with this process. And that's kind of it. A lot of words, not too many pictures, but I'm very much welcome what your thoughts are on the concepts and whether this is going in the right direction or there's more considerations I haven't thought of.
So, Gus, if I can jump in here, maybe the salient points that I take away from that is that your approach looks at the wells individually and looks for periods of time where we might get to the minimum threshold within 20 years. So that's the first trigger that we're looking at 5 year, we're looking at some increment of time.
Yeah.
20 plus, I'm going to say 40, whatever. And then we develop that slope and we look at that slope and we say, okay, in 20 years, we're going to get there. That's the first trigger.
Yeah.
And so the next year we would start to decrease pumping by 5%. And then look at it again in 5 years.
Right.
And make the same evaluation. And then if it's leveled out, we're good. If it's still declining, we go another 5%. And we do it in increments of 5% for, how many every years we need to get to until we level out.
That's the basic idea, right?
So Mr. Penziera has a question.
Sure.
So right at the beginning of the thing we talked about, you could actually make a switch in 1 year if you needed to. So if you recovered in 1 year, why would you wait till year 5 to do your evaluation. And we know that as flashy as Arroyo Seco is, it would come back. I mean, it came back in 1 year in 14, 15, 16. So why would you wait to 5 year to stop your demand management?
Yeah, there's kind of uh, um, a gray zone between sort of short-term water level declines and long-term water level declines. That's a distinction we made in the SMC TAC, because you see these droughts coming along, and particularly droughts where they stop the conservation releases from the reservoirs. Those become very pronounced in terms of the water level hydrographs, and so we thought that there was sort of there needed to be management actions related to those short-term impacts of losing reservoir recharge. That might be different than the management actions you take for long-term trends. But to be honest, if a drought comes along and water levels are dropping, you start getting de facto demand management if people's wells don't produce so much. So yeah, there's a little bit of overlap between what you do for a short-term situation and what you do for a long-term situation. And I'm not sure I can give you a clearer distinction than that. But you're right. Well, like I said, for these long-term trends, they're showing up over periods of multiple decades. So you would get wet years coming along, and if after 5 years if in the 5 year analysis period had a bunch of wet years, you might say, well, looks like we're good. We can turn off the demand management and just keep going until if declining trends show up again.
So Gus, just maybe to take it another step, if we're thinking about how to implement this, and to Alan's point, we do see some pretty significant rebounds in the Arroyo Seco cone and through the forebay in general if there's adequate recharge. If we were in a period where we've elected to make some sort of decision to use demand management and saw significant recharge, we could eliminate the need to do demand management in the subsequent year if that's what we thought was an appropriate action.
I think that's reasonable. I mean, wet years are great, and you might as well take advantage of them. When you have them, and then if you get a break during the wet year, but then if you fall back into a declining trend, then you put the demand management back in if you need to. Yeah,
Right.
you can do this year by year.
I mean, it's an important one to make, that we're talking about long-term issues. And so even if we see a rebound, from the last drought, we've seen the groundwater basin come back up, but it hasn't come back up all the way yet. Hasn't quite refilled. And that's part of the long-term watch and make certain that we've got a situation where we're going to refill.
When you look at your map though with the red dots are all up there in one area, and the rest of it is recovered. I mean, I can see maybe where that area needs to do something different than this, but if you're looking at the demand management on the whole area, I think it needs to be evaluated every year. And the SMC TAC meets every year. Right.
Yeah, no, I very much agree that you should look for local problem areas. And I use that map as just an illustration because it's what emerged from my trend analysis. But it perfectly illustrates a situation where you might circle all those red dots and say, here's where we need to do something, for the next year or 2 or 5, and not the whole subbasin.
So Gus, I think it's important that we at least acknowledge that we could see, a significant wet period follow a decision to make demand management part of the management actions for a basin, and that would change our perspective. So I think the SMC TAC and the boards could make a decision to eliminate demand management if indeed the groundwater basin had recovered adequately.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I think it's important that we think about these things now, and as you start to develop your procedure, and, we start taking this into a broader context, we may want to have an opportunity to make those kind of flexible changes. You mentioned that the program was flexible by nature, so why not
Right.
have some flexibility?
Yeah, that actually seems reasonable. And you're right. We look at data every year. You don't really have to wait 5 years. The long-term trends might not change that much, but if you get like I said, if you get one or two couple of wet years, things look good, and there's probably no reason to be doing demand management in those years. And then you can see over time whether you need to do demand management in more years.
And it's kind of difficult to talk about long-term issues here in the Aroostook Cone, or even in the forebay, because candidly, this groundwater basin does rebound as long as there's recharge.
Well, I mean, that's true, and we see these long-term trends. So it doesn't rebound and all the way back to where it was.
Your mic on, Nancy? There's an on button. There you go.
Thank you. I have a couple questions. One, just really felt I needed to say. So when they talked about the M&A method and said, for instance, one of the limitations was using the 3-year drought, such as 2013 to 2015. But that's a time period when the reservoirs were operated outside that what's allowed with the permit. And so that really is an anomaly. And I don't know I don't think that should be used as a target or time frame. Well, I know that's something that M&A did, but it doesn't seem consistent with if you were looking at a normal drought period.
I get what your point is.
Mhm.
Two things. I mean, we did use that same period to set our minimum threshold.
No.
The minimum threshold was set during that last drought.
Oh, okay, 2015.
Yeah.
It was 2015, but this is 2013 to 2015.
Yeah, I see your point that we may have used a condition that won't occur in the future because of the way the reservoirs were operated. The reservoirs can't create water, so there certainly would be years, and probably at least 2 years in a row, when the reservoirs just run out of water. But whether that 3 years in a row, which was, I think the first time that had happened, might have been due to, a type of operation that wouldn't occur in the future. I don't know. We picked that to set the minimum thresholds, but maybe for the GSP update, we should reconsider whether those levels are too low because it was anomalous in terms of reservoir operation. That's a valid question.
A couple things. I think to Nancy's point about how low it is, we could get into a series of a severe drought where there were no water in the reservoirs, and we could return it. It's speculative, but it's a what if. But more importantly, Gus, is the period of time in which we look at. Because what that analysis is going to do is it's going to look at that drought just as a low spot, and it's going to look at kind of how the overall groundwater basin is faring over time. And if we have it long enough, it's going to pick up a drought and it's going to pick up wet years. And we want to see what the trend is for the long term. That's really the key piece. So it's not necessarily the bottom of the trough, it's the average.
Well, I understand that, and I'm certainly not the expert like Gus and you are, but it just seems to me that if that's a time period, when we want to look at something, because going forward, we're going to be looking at how the reservoirs are operated pursuant to, their permit, et cetera.
No question. It's one of the issues that both Gus and I raised at the SMC TAC, was we thought that the period that Montgomery and Associates had used was inappropriate.
Right.
Because that drought really does skew, and left that drought in the 20 teens skews our groundwater look,
Right,
you know, over the last 20 years. That's why if we look at 40 or 50 years in the Arroyo Seco, we see it, you know, it going up and down and rebounding. And it's that trend line that we want to check. And if you look at the groundwater basin, in some areas, it's tilted a little downward, which is, I think, indicative of just a time frame where we had a little less recharge. But if that continues, we want to have a procedure which to deal with.
so, thank you, because, yes, I agree, but I have a couple other questions, can
Go
I?
ahead, and then
So,
we'll go to Mr. Fromm.
when you talk about look backs and looking back at a historical period, how far back would you look back, and what would the starting point? Let's say we did it today, and you're gonna look back as an example. What would be your look back period?
Yeah, what I indicate is you want a period that's long enough that you get a variety of water types and probably have at least one drought in there. So it should be at least 20 years. If you go back farther, you start getting into different historical cropping patterns and different reservoir operation modes, which could be influencing things. That's the trade-off. But it gets selected on the basis of sort of cumulative departure of hydrology things, reservoir rainfall and reservoir releases and reservoir storage, and wanting to have, like I said, an average, some sort of average representation of hydrology in your analysis period. So yeah, you sort of look at the historical hydrology and pick what looks like a representative period, but it needs to be fairly long.
Yeah, and I know this is just beginning and for the discussion and stuff, but it seems like some of those details you might want to have incorporated so that it's not just left to somebody else to say, well, is this look back period appropriate, or really it should include this. Yeah. So just
yeah, it's tricky. Hydrologists can disagree. So Derek came up with a different analysis period because he was really keen on eliminating stuff before the Salinas Valley Water Project went online in like 2009 or something. And so he had a shorter period, and the SMC TAC had been using longer periods. But it was problematic because of some really wet years in the mid 1990s. So yeah, it's something where it's hard to prescribe an exact process. You kind of have to, have hydrologists who are weighing the pros and cons of each potential window of time in terms of being representative.
Well, Gus, and we're at a discussion. We're at the beginning. You might get some requests from, the stakeholders to use 40 or 50 years. And then
Right.
we caveat it, of course. But the point is that we haven't made that decision yet.
okay, thank you. And then last question, Tim, thank you. So you talked about the SMC TAC decides, but we need to have I guess it would be the SMC TAC working together, making a recommendation and bringing it to what? Just kind of clarify some of the process there for the actual decision making.
Process-wise, the Arroyo Seco cone is going to work with this template, and we'll decide how that goes. And my hope is that it can be replicated elsewhere, but we're going to make sure that we've got a process and a procedure that we agree with here for the cone.
So it's going to be the Arroyo Seco GSA Advisory Committee.
And the Arroyo Seco board.
Yes, but making maybe a recommendation to the board, and the board would make the decision.
Correct.
Yeah, it's not the SMC TAC, so thank you.
That's right.
Yeah.
Mr. Fromm.
That may have clarified it a little bit. My question, Gus, one of my questions was had to do with the Montgomery strategy on demand management, and it didn't sound like they had allowances for a more local strategy. They were looking at basin-wide, and what you're suggesting is very, very different. And maybe it was answered with Curtis's response just then. The Arroyo Seco Basin could make management recommendations even if they're different than what Montgomery or the entire GSA approves?
Yes,
That's correct. We have the authority, to do that, regardless of what the data show. We can do that.
It'd be, so it'd be interesting to figure out how to define what local is then, how big a radius on the throw net are you using to create the local piece?
Yeah, I actually tried to a year and a half ago, I tried to come up with an objective procedure for sort of circling wells and seeing a pattern, and wound up concluding that wasn't going to work very well. So, yeah, it's in the current iteration. I say, well, you circle the wells that you think are included in that low spot with extending with an envelope that goes at least 1,000 feet outside the cluster of wells that seem to be having the problem. It is a little bit subjective, but I don't think it'd be so. You may not get that much disagreement on where the problem area is.
So then following up on what Nancy was talking about, I certainly recognize what Nancy's talking about with is the Montgomery or the selection of the 2015 minimum threshold faulty or not based on how they were managing the reservoirs. But for the red dots west of Arroyo Seco, that's not really dependent on what's going on with the reservoir releases.
Not so much, right? They're pretty far from the Salinas River. I mean, the whole basin feels the bigger effects of Salinas River recharge, but they're far enough away they could have their own local problem.
yeah, those wells, as I recall, are pretty high up in the watershed as well, so they may be separated vertically.
Yeah.
The drought in the 90s, whenever it was, the Roy Seco side had more problems than the other side. And I don't know how much effect the dams even had, west of the freeway.
Something to watch.
Yeah.
Any other committee comments? We'll go on to the public. Mr. Versick, thank you for your patience. Go ahead.
Thank you, Tom Versick speaking. It sounds like a really good first approach to some of the advantages of both kinds of approaches. So that's great. Some of the things I was going to mention were covered by other commenters. But one thing I will bring up, and I can't remember and I don't have the time to look up the statute, but there is a SGMA statute which says essentially it's not an undesirable result if water levels drop but then rebound when the drought is over. And so it would be important when this becomes some sort of written formal policy down the road that possibly that statute is either referenced, copied, whatever it is that happens to be, because if it's justified to write the policy in terms that things drop below the MTs, but they're not undesirable results, then you're better off writing it in those terms rather than acknowledging that anything is an undesirable result. Again, if factually that turns out to be the case. And then just a quick from memory response to something Mr. Fromm raised about the framework and whether the other GSA, whether their framework contemplates local demand management versus sub-basin wide. That's the terms they use. I don't think the framework does. I agree, but GSA staff on any number of occasions has made the point, orally at least, that demand management needs to be tailored to particular areas in particular ways and that sort of thing. So at least you'll find narrative statements in the record about all that, but I don't think actually in the framework, and that's one of my clients' issues, is the framework says one thing and staff says something different. Right. But that's neither here nor there for what's going on right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Versick. I think one thing we might be talking a little bit past each other. We've kind of operated on this basis where we know that the Arroyo Seco and the larger forebay are gonna be okay, as long as it rains and we get some recharge. We're gonna have ups and downs, but by and large, the basin's going to recover, and we've seen that, I don't know, for 100 years. So, we're gonna be able to weather drought, periods. And, and Alan, to your point earlier, when you talked about, seeing a recovery in a single year, what Gus is trying to do is look out beyond that drought kind of scenario. What happens if this dry period that we're in continues for 50 years? And we really do have less recharge than we do today. That's something that we need to be prepared for. So we're trying to take a long-term look kind of through the drought response into how we might try to manage the groundwater basin for that 40, 50-year kind of horizon. And it's kind of hard to get our brains around because of the way the groundwater basin has responded, but this is a good first step. You've given Gus and I something to think about. Now we'll go back and kind of tweak some things and come back. Go ahead, Nancy.
Plus, Curtis, I think it shows that the Aurora Seco GSA is being forward-thinking and looking ahead. So as opposed to having somebody else dictate, a kind of demand management program.
Yeah, even though we're looking backwards.
Yeah,
I couldn't resist. But you're right. We're trying to be proactive. We're trying to be proactive and develop a forward-looking approach.
Yeah.
Any other comments from committee? Any other public comment? Okay.
Well, let's really look at this picture here on a longer term basis. Do I need to turn on something here? Can everybody hear?
I think you're
I can hear you.
Can you hear Jerry?
Yes, I can.
So, for instance, I bought here more than 50 years ago, and it was because the Aurora Seco was undammed, so it couldn't be mismanaged like we sometimes feel. We have a drought, then we shut off the flow from the reservoirs. We know we have the reservoir problems here. So I think I'm all for Gus's much longer term thing. But I think the idea that there may be some areas of this, for instance, I don't recall that the what we call the San Lucia Highlands were farmed as much as they were, and they weren't as farmed 50 years ago as much as they are now. It was kind of grass, native grass type
Right.
thing. So it seems to me that that area, and Gus, if you break it out, that area needs to be looked at a little carefully, or a little separately, maybe. Okay. Because, and I think back to Al's comment a few months ago, when when we had a drought, what he did is rather than farming 2 crops, he farmed a crop and a half or something like that. That was in effect what you said. I think he didn't plant a full second crop, is what you said. Now, however, we have some changes going on in the overall, in the macro economy. The biggest one of which is the wine industry, or the wine industry. The wine industry appears to be in a decline internationally. We don't know when it will come back, but because wine is 8,000 years old or so, it will continue some way, but maybe at a lesser extent. So all you have to do is go down Elm Avenue here and turn right on Central Avenue and see half of that area has been, vineyards have been removed. The reason I say that is because I don't know if all of that can be row cropped again. In Paso, for instance, when they remove vineyards there, that it doesn't lend itself. The soil isn't such that the topography isn't such that you can go there. So it's a different situation. So it seems to me that and I realize that this area that I'm talking about south here is really in Upper Valley. Where's the actual boundary of the 4 bays? At about a mile south of, or 2 miles south of, in effect, of Elm Avenue.
Yeah.
So it's Lago Marcino? Okay, I hadn't really heard that clarification. So then there's some that is in the forebay here, because if you go down, there's the 700 acres there that sat unfarmed for 3 years and still unfarmed. That you go down Elm Avenue on the left-hand side, and then Jerry Raba and some others bought 285 acres. There's still 500 acres, and I don't know if there's a deal on that yet. That's been unfarmed. Now, another thing is as to how much particular crops used. And there are vineyard farmers that are using, maybe here in the coast or in Paso Robles at least, I don't know about here, 2 acre feet. We used 9/10 of an acre foot, for instance. And we went many years ago, the idea is that to what we call the Golden Gate Bridge, and I learned this in France 40 years ago. They irrigate with rainfall in the winter, then they don't have the ability to irrigate in the summer. That makes what's better grapes that they have in the Bordeaux region, because then you have the vines are more open, the berries are smaller, you get more skin contact, and so forth. When we over irrigate vineyards here, then it's lesser quality. And we have to be in the quality thing. We have 25 different items, and not a one of them, we never release anything that's less than a 90 at lower. Other people are putting in bigger purple and doing all kinds of things. So how do you handle an area where some people are farming using 9/10 of an acre foot, and with 2 crops, you got to be using, let's say 2, just in simple terms, maybe use more. 3, okay? So I knew that.
The short answer?
Well,
The short answer is no organization, no governmental body has ever tried to regulate what kind of agriculture you do on the ground.
so that's what I was going to say. So that's one of the things that's going to happen. So go ahead.
And Jerry, I've been waiting to see the data for this last year to compare to pumping, you know, and to see if there's any kinds of trends, because I think what I just heard you say was that there's some areas that have gone fallow, but some areas have been replaced with other kinds of crops. So I'm curious as to what that has done to the overall water usage.
My guess is that in that particular area, from Elm Avenue down to where Central Avenue comes out to the freeway, the very south end of that, the folks from Canada came in there a couple of years ago and spent a tremendous amount of money. At least that's what I'm told. You know, they changed the elevation there by 10 or 15 feet. They took off the topsoil, cut it down, and leveled it where it was undulating there. They did that. So that area probably is using it at 2 acre feet or 2.5 acre feet or something like that. I think that it could come back at some time to much of that area, could come back to some form of higher use than vineyards, or maybe the vineyards there have been using them. So I don't think it's I don't think it's a long-term problem there of the scale that we need to. I for Gus's thing, let's look at the 20-year period, the 25-year period, 30-year period, and this idea of demand management. I'm very much against the proposals that were coming from the fellows presenting that, because they were just presenting something to be presented. And so that was disgusting, quite frankly. Now we're looking at realistic. And realistic, I think, is that we need to be aware, but we need to have a much longer viewpoint.
Agree 100%.
25 years is kind of a minimum as far as I'm concerned.
Nancy?
It just made me think of something when you talk about the overall demand management. So, and even looking at a smaller area, say if you looked at an area with locally 1,000 feet or whatever, then seems like it would be important, is everybody within that area going to be required to reduce the same level? Could it be, I mean, it goes to kind of what Jerry said, different properties, different owner, some people are more efficient than others. I mean, so these are all, I think, pieces of information that are going to need to be looked at, should be looked at when you consider ultimately how you would frame that level of reduction for a certain area.
Could not agree more. I mean, there's the
Yeah.
first step is we're kind of taking out, we're getting pieces on the table. And I'll just, San Jose Highlands is a easy target because frankly, the wells are different than the wells that are down in the valley floor. They're different than the wells next to the Arroyo Seco. And they show different characteristics. They show pretty quick decline. I imagine groundwater elevation there drops pretty quickly when they pump them. And we may take like that area and have different kinds of criteria that we would apply to demand management than say somebody that was right next to the Arroyo Seco River. And so that's like the next refinement. In addition, we would want to look at crop types because, for instance, if you know, is it really a reduction if you go from a crop that uses 2.5 acre feet an acre to 2 acre feet an acre?
No, not necessarily, because it's going to undulate.
Exactly. So if we take a longer time period to try to get our data, try to get our approach, we look at the characteristics of the individual wells in the area, we can make more informed decisions about how to potentially implement a demand management framework.
I want to respond to Nancy's point there. You're right. In a typical adjudication, they have everybody reduced by a uniform percentage of what their historical use had been. But as you pointed out, that means the people who used a lot of water, you know, still end up with a lot more water. You get the race to the pump house problem. And an alternative approach would be you specify how many acre feet per acre people get in that area. And the people who have been thrifty all along might not have to change anything they're doing. But the people who've been growing higher water use crops might have to shift or something, or switch from sprinkler to drip or yeah. So and there's two approaches. One is you decrease everyone by a percentage, and the other is you allocate a number of feet per year of applied water, and each grower can decide what they're going to do about that.
I don't know what, I don't understand the whole adjudication deal, but when you get into water rights and stuff, I think your history means a lot to what you're going to end up with. And I don't know that the GSA would have any right to do anything different than that. That would be a percentage.
Are you saying across the board or?
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Answer for
Mr. Versick, you have a comment?
I do, and I'm not going to give you any legal advice. Only practical, which is that every single thing everyone is talking about, all of which matter a lot, are going to be thrashed out in a different part of the valley first. So everyone can learn many kinds of things from whatever's going to go forward.
That's a very good point.
Perhaps. I think what is
But we
important-
may need to be the intellectual leaders for what's happening in the other areas.
So it's important that we start this. That's why I think we need to start the discussion so that we get it framed up correctly. There's lots of details. And you're right. I think somebody else is going to get to it a lot quicker than we are.
But they may, but I think that's why I, give up doing other things to come and sit in on this thing. Because I think we need to still be in the game.
Agree. I think I want to lead the game. I want to be out front rather than look behind.
You could be out front, but you may not wind up being a leader.
We cannot dictate terms for the entire valley. Don't want to. But in our little neck of the woods, if we have a plan that we feel comfortable implementing, I think that's what we really need to focus on. Now, there's going to be others that I think are going to hit the crossroads on demand management quicker than we are. Mr. Versky, you still have your hand up, or do you have another comment? Thank you. Any other? I mean,
I just think we need to be in the game.
Mm-hmm.
But we need to I like Gus Yates' thing, a much longer view. We need to have some simple concepts. For instance, I underlined many things on the 6 pages here, but I was trying to look where he got it down to, where he had 14 different items here. And some of those had sub-items and so forth. And then he gave a very different set there. I'm not complaining about that. I think we need to come out of this with a few simple concepts. Longer time. There'll be some variability in the district because of the topography in the district, because of the nearness to the river. And obviously with the best area down here, the best area here, for instance, the entire area, is this area that's between the undammed Arroyo Seco and the Salinas over there. How would you like to be in the east side? We took our kids up to Fat City on the east side in 1974 or 5, and we heard them, their wells are dropping, their waters are dropping. The east side, you look at that long term, it's come like that.
Yeah, but to your point, and that's why I tried to boil it down a little bit. We want to take a long-term look at the data behind us to give us the trend. We want to look at individual wells, and we want to do some data analysis right on, right in the area. So we want both the geography, the well type, and compare it with long-term trends. There we go. What you got, Gus?
Yeah, I just want to put some perspective on long term. It gets difficult for a while to decide whether this long-term trend is permanent or it's just a long-term climate deviation. And I'm going to show you some examples. These are what are called cumulative departure plots of precipitation from various stations in California. And so the blue bars are the annual precipitation, and the red bar is the cumulative departures. So if you have a bunch of years in a row that are below average, the red line goes down. And if you have years that are above average, the red line goes up. And so I'm just going to show you some. Here's this particular station was 15% on average below, 15% below average over a 20-year period there in the early 60s, 6% per year below average for 25 years. Here's, whoops, hold on. I'm not getting to the next one. Okay, here's one in San Francisco. It was 7% below average for 56 years and then got wet again. And let's see if I should have some more. I have to do it with my mouse. Monterey, 12% below average for 26 years, and then it got wet again. So you can have these long-term droughts that are just part of California climatic variability. But nowadays, there's a tendency to assume that we're in a permanent climate change condition, and it's not so obvious that we're in a permanent climate change condition instead of just one of these longer dry periods. And so that's sort of partly why I picked the 20-year intervals. Well, even if it's going to get wet again in the future, if we're getting that close to minimum thresholds, maybe we ought to start doing something. And then if the wet weather comes along, great, we come out of it okay. But if we wait till too late, and it keeps going and going, then people really start hurting.
So Gus, the term that we picked, whatever the duration, will be important, no question. But what I want the committee to consider is what we're trying to do relative to sigma. We have a charge that we've got to be sustainable. It doesn't mean that we're going to, implement demand management straight away, but we got to have a plan.
Mm-hmm.
Be able to show them and demonstrate we can get there if we have to, and that we're going to be data driven. And that way we can show that we are sustainable today and sustainable in the future. And frankly, avoid all the other nonsense. That's what I'm trying to give us.
But if you start getting this major climate change here, this is long-term major change.
They can, well, and we've seen it in the past.
That's not going to do well for coming into the data we were talking about, the 5-year and 20-year and so forth. This is longer term and more severe than what we've been talking about.
Could be. You're right. Could be. Some of the long-term models for climate change in this area don't necessarily show a decrease in the amount of rainfall, They do show a decrease in the number of storms with increased intensity. So I don't know how that'll play in
So
terms.
then I think we need to get our climate change to as small an area as possible.
Sure.
I mean, my wife is in South Dakota. They've had, she's been in the basement. I was with her there last week. We were in the basement once. And she's been in the basement 3 times because of tornadoes within 10 miles. Scary and used to have that.
Yep. Tim, did you have a comment? Sorry.
There was a question for Gus. I really appreciated your green line trends, your that data set that showed that most of the trends were declining, but not at a rate to worry about. And most of the information, I think, is based on current land use and current demand. And as Jerry says, crops appear like they could be changing. Demand may be increasing. Is there something that you could add to the trend lines to remind everybody that if demand increases 20% per year, that the trend lines are going to get steeper?
That's right.
And you're going to approach minimum threshold a lot faster. To warn people that it's not just demand management when you're, at the long-term trend, but you can get there a lot faster if demand is starting to increase.
Right. And that would emerge in our correlation analysis of the related factors. If you did see that uptick in demand, the GEMS system that the Water Resources Agency has would pick that up, and you'd start seeing the uptick in demand and see that correlates with the water level trends. As I said, the recent analysis didn't actually show an increase in demand. Actually, it's been a little bit low the last few years. So that isn't what's currently driving water level declines.
Just another thought. I was trying to think. So, because how is this what the Rosseco GSA is doing with regards to demand management? How is it going to dovetail into what the Salinas Valley Basin GSA is doing for demand management, and particularly for the 4-Bay as a whole?
So that's a good question. That's another reason why I wanted to get out in front. It's not 100% clear right now how that's going to work, but as we work through the issues originally with the SMC TAC, most of those kind of big picture frame up was then used by the Salinas Valley Basin GSA for the whole basin. So Gus has undergone an analysis, and it's being talked about at the SMC TAC. I've chatted with both Perret and Emily Gardner about the fact that we're doing this in the Arroyo Seco Cone, and they're interested in what we are going to find and develop. I think if we develop a well thought out plan, it's likely that it could be implemented elsewhere. And we're in our 5th year of our first GSP. And we're not at a point where this is ready for prime time. It's not ready to go to print. It's not a policy. It's not ready for action. But we are going to acknowledge that we're working on this kind of approach for long-term sustainability.
The other place, I think, because you're the advisory committee, you're there for the Rosseco GSA.
Yeah, say it,
right? And Curtis is a rep on the Salinas Valley Basin's GSA advisory committee he's the representative for the Rosseco GSA.
Correct.
So I believe they're going to move forward at some point and talk about more about demand management, et cetera. And it would seem like that would also be a good opportunity to share what's being done here as maybe a template for what could be done in other.
Yeah, I just don't ever want to get out in front of the board, but I can tell the advisory committee that we're actively working on it. And the staff knows. So, what we're trying to do is be thoughtful and methodical about our approach to get something that we think is solid. I really appreciate all the comment that we had thus far. I want to kind of grind it up a little bit with Gus and then bring something back to you guys.
Question.
Yeah.
How many acres do we have in Rosseco? GSA.
I think it's round numbers about 22,000.
Is that much?
I think so.
So we're 8% of the total 250 then.
Yeah. Got that.
And the water that we use here is certainly less than that. Because for the Upper Valley, for instance, for its acreage uses much less. Somewhere in all the various things, I'm going to 5 different things. We've got another one this afternoon. There's the big one tomorrow, board meeting. Then there's the, I think some of us are going to be at the one in King City on Friday morning at 9 a.m.
There's one.
And then we've got another one right here at 11:30, I think.
Well, not right.
Oh, not right. Oh, no, down there.
Yeah.
Yeah, but here in Green. Right.
And since you mentioned that, I'm going to slide just a little bit into the general manager's report, which is the next item on the agenda. That Friday committee meeting
At 9 a.m. or
is
the
9 a.m. in King City, is aimed at providing the committee with information about the upcoming changes to the GSP. As you remember, in the GSP, when we put it together, we had some corrective actions. Water quality being one, and integrated surface water supply being another. We have yet to receive DWR direction on integrated surface water issues. That's been coming for 5 years and hasn't arrived. It's because the darn thing's so complicated, frankly. Not every groundwater basin and river system is the same. And the water quality issue is complicated in that there's all kinds of people that are a part of that process, and we might have not picked the right way in which to frame it. Anyways, those are going to be corrected through an amendment process. And what's important to recognize is those GSPs are the legal documents that govern how we do things in the Arroyo Seco Cone and the forebay. So they're important. The update is pretty, manageable. I think the biggest thing is we're going to recognize that we're going to need to do some sort of long-term planning for demand management and just say that. But to get the information and participate is really important. So thank you. That ends my GM report.
I thought that they were going, the staff was gonna bring management action projects that are being discussed in other portions of GSA that might impact or may not impact the forebay, so we could understand what the projects may have.
So Tim, there is a information item that has all that data in there for you to look at, to see. The thing that the Salinas Valley Basin GSA has said is that none of the projects impact the forebay or the upper valley.
It's a no action alternative.
Yep.
If you look at, it's kind of hidden, but if you look at the BGR link, you click on that and then you dig through it, there's another link for the no action alternative.
But Emily is going to be there and she's going to make that point. I
you
just
hope
want,
she'll make that point.
what's that?
You hope she'll make that point?
Emily Gardner is going to be there. She's going to make that point.
You think she will?
Yeah, I talked to her today about it.
Okay, all right, good.
And if she misses it, I'll take it on. Because what, I want you to know they are listening. They're trying.
Yeah.
Oh. Surprise. Any other comments?
What's the next action? You were gonna have your general manager's report here?
I just did it.
You just did, okay.
So Curtis, is this something I should write up and as a memo? So that we've got it documented more than just a PowerPoint?
I guess I couldn't understand you. I'm sorry.
Okay. I was saying, are these concepts I presented today, is this something I should write up as a document that can be circulated? Is that an appropriate next step or what?
I think you and I need to circle back and kind of tweak this document a little bit before we circulate it.
Okay. Sounds good.
I would feel a little bit more comfortable, because we haven't taken it to the board at all. Right? And we got some comment from the committee, so I think in terms of process, you and I ought to take
Okay.
it, bring it back to this group, take it out to the ASGSA Board of Directors for presentation, and then we can release it.
All right.
I mean, as a practical matter, it's all now public comment. So, I mean, so you could release it, but I would say that it's draft and provisional.
Right, of course. Yeah.
Anything else for the good of the order? We are adjourned.
All right. See you all.
Thanks, guys, very much. Appreciate it.